So I'm going to be concentrating on fighting imperialism in Africa, and I want to start by talking a bit about what imperialism is and what it means. Now, people may or may not know that the American Army has a series of regional commands for different areas of the world, not of America. The one of them, the most recent one to be set up, is AFRICOM, which was set up in 2007. This is some US soldiers last year standing out. Now, people may be interested to know that the headquarters of AFRICOM, which is to control US's military dealings with Africa, is in Frankfurt in Germany. Now, why? It's not in Frankfurt at all, it's in Stuttgart in Germany, but still, it's in Germany. It's not anywhere in Africa. Indeed, they've just been told to leave where they are in Germany, but they haven't got a new venue. One thing that happened is, for PR reasons, they thought it would be a good idea to set up a big headquarters for this organization in Africa, despite the fact that many African leaders are real supporters of American neoliberalism. None of them would allow it to come into their country. And I think this says something about the feeling amongst a lot of Africans about having American military bases in their country. So that's a background fact to start off with. Another one, and I think this is an interesting one about imperialism in general, is the G7. Let's start with the richest countries which were meeting in Cornwall last week. This is the leaders socially distanced round a table, having a chat about things. Now, one of the things that they were talking about was China's anti-democratic policies. Now, I just want to start by saying that I agree China has anti-democratic policies. However, the thing that was upsetting these leaders was that, well, what China is trying to do economically. They launched a thing called the Build Back Better World initiative. I think that's a stupid name, but let's leave it off. The idea is that they want to provide a transparent infrastructure partnership with countries in the global south. So it's saying, do deals with us, we'll look out for you. Why are they doing this? They're really annoyed because lots of countries have been doing deals with China. And one of the reasons that they've been doing deals with China is because on the whole, China offers them a better deal. You get the things that the demands that the Western companies have made were supposedly not included in deals that China's made. Now, China launched a thing in 2013 called the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm afraid all these imperialist initiatives have enormously long and complicated names, I think, to make them sound important. The Belt and Road Initiative is a trade route, which they say is China says it's planning to recreate the Silk Road, which would allow trade all across Asia and actually elsewhere. Interestingly enough, many of the countries that got involved in this are now starting to complain about it. And the reason they're complaining is because the Chinese government said, we will offer all sorts of investment help and then you'll be better off for trading. When people have looked at the small print, what they've discovered is that you get offered money as long as you spend it on Chinese companies. Now, this is very much like Western aid. It's part of an economic development process. And I will come back to China in a bit, but I want to say that the most amazing thing about the G7 is the startling hypocrisy of Western powers complaining about China getting involved in Africa in a way that it might not be in Africa's interest. I mean, they weren't specifically talking about Africa in this area, but I will come back to the way that Chinese involvement in Africa has reignited an imperialist rivalry. So I want to start by talking about not the new imperialism, but the old imperialism, because sometimes when we're talking about what's happening anywhere in the global south, you will hear people like the G7 leaders talking as if there's been hundreds of years of peaceful trade going on, and now you have a nasty authoritarian country like China coming in to try and mess it up. So I want to go through a quick reminder of some of the trade that's been going on. Firstly, the first big trade that involved the West and Africa was the slave trade, which was a trade where, this is the map of the triangular slave trade, ships from Europe would take manufactured goods to the west coast of Africa, which they would sell, and then would buy people and take them across the Atlantic enslaved to work on plantations back to Europe. It was this process that got the raw money, which was used to launch industrial capitalism, that made the West really, really rich. It was not done to benefit Africans, though you might, from sometimes the way it's reported, think that it had been. And I want to say something else about Africa in the past, which is that there is an idea, and it's still kind of popular in the popular press and so on, that Africa was a place where nothing ever happened. It was a place without history until Europeans arrived. So I want to go back to just say a couple of things before we move on to a more modern work. This is a mosque. It's in East Africa. Either I can't remember if it's currently in Kenya or Tanzania, but in the 1300s, a guy called Ibn Battuta, who was a Moroccan explorer, visited this town. Now, he was someone who makes Marco Polo look like someone who didn't get out much. He traveled all around Southern Europe. He went to China. He went to India. He was basically looking around the Islamic world at the time. His book is very interesting, but I'm not going to say anything about it, except to quote what he said when he went to Kilwa, having been to all these places. Kilwa is one of the most beautiful and well-constructed towns in the world. The whole of it is elegantly built. The roofs are built with mangrove pole. There is very much rain. He didn't much like this bit. The people are engaged in a holy war, for their country lies beside the pagan Zanj. I'm not going to go on about all that. The important point about this is that he saw that the city that he came across in East Africa was one of the best that he'd ever come across. That was in 1330. This is a drawing by, I think it was a Dutch trader, of the city of Loango in northern Congo, which is, I believe, in about 1600. Again, this is before the incursion. It's during the early period of the slave trade, but before the incursions of most of the Western powers. I think that even to this day, a lot of people in the West would not know that there were cities like this in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa was devastated by the slave trade for reasons I'm not going to, well, because it took away a lot of the best manpower and turned person power, I should say, and turned society permanently war economies, which meant that a lot of societies had collapsed by the time, a couple of hundred years later, when the Western powers wanted to actually get involved. Now, it's interesting, the Western powers had developed, Britain, France, and a couple of others, had developed a need for resources and markets for their capitalist development. And they were starting to occupy territories. They were moving into Africa with armies, and their big problem was the armies would occasionally meet each other and fight. So they thought it would be best if we had a conference and sorted it all out in a civilized way, which they did. And here's a cartoon of it. This is the Berlin Conference of 1884-5. This is Bismarck, the German leader, dividing Africa up like a cake. And I think it's actually a very honest representation of what happened there. There weren't any Africans there. This is why Africa is divided up with straight line borders, and it was about the interests of the big imperial powers at the time, nothing to do with the interests of Africans. So this is how this situation arose, and this is the British coming into some of their territory, the kingdom of excuse me, Ashanti in West Africa, and burning down capital. So that was the beginning of the occupation. Through the 20th century, you saw a growth in attempts to say, you are now part of the empire and the empire is in your interests. These are Kenyan soldiers fighting for the British in Burma in the Second World War. So you saw a lot of people buying the stuff about the empire being there to help you. But at the end of the war, there were a lot of people, you know, the Americans, the British all said, we're in favor of democracy. We want democracy for everyone in the world, except we are actually going to go about re-establishing our colonial empires. This is a meeting in Manchester in 1945, when people from Africa, people who would become African leaders, and great anti-racist leaders, like this is the W.B. Du Bois, who's one of the major black anti-racist leaders in the last century, came together and said, why don't we get independence? And when it wasn't offered, people fought for it. This is a start of a general strike. That's why there's no one much on the streets in Kenya in 1950. This led to an armed rebellion, which is known as the Mau Mau uprising. I'm just giving this as one image. These kinds of uprisings and resistance and suppression of them by the British and other military went on all around Africa. Also other forms of resistance. So you saw anti-imperialists like Nkrumah come up. I've not got time to talk about some of these great and very interesting leaders. What I do want to mention is Patrice Lumumba. He was a socialist who was elected as the head of state in Congo, what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he denounced imperialism and attacked the Belgian imperial had run the country beforehand. He was soon, with the help of not just the Belgians and the Americans, but it seems the UN was involved in it, overthrown and replaced by a reliable dictator, Mobutu, who was an ally. Here he is with President Nixon, but he loved up with all sorts of people. So what you saw with the coming of independence was, firstly, the imperial powers didn't want to give it, though America was quite keen on it because they thought it would allow them access to markets. Then, when, if anyone tried to do things that didn't fit with the interests of the big imperial powers, they would undermine them and try and get rid of them. So this is what the situation was in the post-war period. And as the imperialists had never really gone away, you saw economic problems coming up. And those economic problems were dealt with in a way that fitted with what the imperialists wanted through organizations like the International Monetary Fund, which offers loans and so on to poor countries on the grounds that they do what they're told. And that usually means opening up to the free market. It usually investment. It means stopping having local companies or locally state-owned things, doing things not for profit, and allowing big multinationals coming in. It's very much, if you think about it, what they're trying to do to the health service at the moment, saying you can't have a health service like this, and health service is one of the first things they went for, incidentally, across Africa. You have to have one that makes a profit for some multinational company. So this is how imperialism has related to Africa. I would want to just quickly stop and make a statement about what imperialism is. Because of the way that imperialism has laid waste to Africa, it's often seen as being something where rich countries get together and exploit poor countries. It's not really about that at all. It's about competition between different capitalist powers. So when you saw the first coming together of imperialists, they were dividing up Africa between them, but it was because they were about conflict with each other, and they didn't want to see what might happen big war or something. What you should do was delay the big war by 20 years or so. And when it happened in Europe, because it was actually the big imperial powers who were fighting against each other. I think this is important because it's important about what happened to Africa in the 1980s. The end of the old imperialism, you'd seen a withdrawal from Africa, and by and large, the imperial powers, rather than thinking this is poor countries we can exploit, thought we can't make much profit here. And on the whole, rather than looking into Africa and doing lots about it, they rather forgot about it. They invested in other places. And Africa was seen as a backwater. This is not because Africa is a backwater. It has lots of resources, it has lots of people who can do things, but it's because in capitalist terms, it wasn't turning a profit in in the way that was required. This turned round in a more recent period. Through the period, certainly since the millennium, there have been a couple of things that have changed around the attitude to Africa in particular. One being increased competition, I mean imperial competition, which means that a new imperial player is on the board. And when I said imperialism is about control of markets and resources, one thing it means is, why, if you had a British Empire, it meant that you had absolute control of an area and could say all these resources have to come to London. You can't sell them to France or America. You have to do it via the metropolitan power, the imperial power. Those kinds of relations, that is always a problem for new powers. So when China emerges as a major imperial power, it wants access to all sorts of things, namely the things other imperialist powers, for instance, oil. And it finds that it has unfavorable deals all over the place because the dealing is being controlled by the IMF and other organizations, big oil companies that are linked to the Western powers, but particularly the American government. And one of the first things it did was look to where on earth is there somewhere where everything isn't totally sewn up. And one of the first places it found was Africa. Because on the whole, not everyone can be bothered with Africa. So China moved in and, for instance, invested in Angola, where it gets a lot of its oil from, and so on. So you start seeing a shift there. That meant that because of worry about it no longer being top imperial power, America started investing again in Africa. It was also worried about things being out of control, what America calls wide open spaces. That is, countries where things would go on outside its imperial control. You could see the emergence of organizations like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or something. They wasn't really about the people who lived in the areas. They were worried about things that were happening outside American control. Notice all the way through, most of these things have absolutely nothing to do live in these places, and I think that this is an important thing that's an ongoing thing. It also means that there have been other resources which the old imperial powers want to get their hands on as well. For instance, metals like coltan and so on, which are mined in the Congo, and that has led to a re-moving in again. And it means that Africa is back involved in the international web of trade. Now, a lot of the big capitalist powers have said this has been great for Africa. It means that there's been a lot of wealth, and there are now ruling African countries who are living much wider Western standards. If you go to the African capitals, my family comes from Kenya. If you go to Nairobi, big supermarkets, there are shopping malls, and you can live a lifestyle with mobile phones, and Wi-Fi and so on, very similar to Western standard. Actually, the things for the vast majority of people. In fact, the reason why you see all these uprisings around Africa is because people are so angry about what's going on. And what's going on is not simply economic. What people may remember before COVID and all the things going around with that, the devastating fires that we saw, remember, in America and Australia and so on, caused by global warming. Precisely these sorts of fires are going on across Africa for the same reasons. They're just less reported. But this kind of feeling of crisis, of things being out of control, is something that has continued throughout the past period. It also means that you have a strange thing going on in Africa where you have a love-hate relationship with imperial powers. I'm going to start with America. I talked about AFRICOM. This is American troops represented by AFRICOM training people in Niger, in Northwest Africa. the governments in places like this both hate having the Americans there, which is why they won't give them a headquarters, but also rely on having an imperial power to come and them and keep their them in place. And therefore, you see them allowing things. There was an issue in Niger, which is why I picked this picture rather than any other, in 2017, where 4 American special forces, what should you call them, soldiers, were killed on an operation. And this is, so that's the news comes out. Otherwise, you often don't hear that these operations are going on, that they're working with local governments, usually against what they call Islamist guerrillas. So there's more to be said about that, which I hope, oh, actually, I don't think I've put the right slide in, so I'll just say it now. People may have noticed just this April, there was a big thing in Mozambique about an Islamist uprising that attacked foreign workers. And it was said that ISIS had got established there. If you look closely at it, it's not really true. There certainly was some kind of uprising, but the idea that it was part of some international Islamic fits rather better with the image that the imperial powers want to give of how society is organized, and how you need a big imperial power to protect you from organizations like ISIS. But it's not really what was going on. And I think it's a part of a very dishonest presentation, but it's also part of an odd thing that's going on with America, because having established AFRICOM, having pushed to have more control in Africa, America is actually talking about withdrawing many of its troops. This was particularly going on under Trump. As you may know, Trump did not want to spend money on foreign interventions. He wanted the kudos that went with being the top imperial power, but hopefully without having to pay for putting troops in and actually keeping control. But it was not just at this point when Trump was in power. It's actually a big change happened under Obama, the government before that, when, because of worry about what China was doing, Obama pivoted military spending to put into the Pacific, and therefore that meant reducing spending in places like Africa. And this is where I want to come back to China and what the expansion of China has meant. It meant, for instance, during COVID, that China has tried to get in Africa and say, we are your friend, we're the person who does good, the country that does good deals with you. But it's actually, again, more and more people in Africa are saying this is very dishonest, partly because people who are coming to operate in Africa are behaving in a high-handed and generally racist fashion. So the idea that we are your socialist friends, which people sometimes put across, seems less believable when they behave more like old imperialists. And there seem to be some things where there are questionable motives. This doesn't mean that people, that some governments don't get things out of them. So again, sticking with China, this is the opening of a new railway. It's interesting, people may not know, the country of Kenya was built on a rail, wanted to be able to get inland into Africa, so they built a railway, and they built a country around it, which is Kenya. That railway, for various reasons, just went into decline. It's been in decline for years and years. Chinese just replaced it a couple of years ago. This is the opening of the new railway, which means that freight can travel, but it still travels by the same route, which gets things from the inland to the coast, so they can be sailed off to China. So actually the same imperial relationship remains. And a lot of people are saying, what are the actual benefits for local people of having a high-speed railway? And that, I think, is a question that comes up, but now itself as a country that has specific interests in this area, and that means it's starting to want to impose force. This is this military base in Africa, in Djibouti. It's interesting because Djibouti is a place that has previously had other military bases for other imperial powers in it. but China wants to be able to be in a position where it can impose force around the world. It doesn't have the scale of military that somewhere like America still has, but it is catching up. And it's changed very quickly. I haven't got time to go through this in detail. If you are interested, there's a very good article by Adrian Budd in the new International, and you can see that online. But what we see is China, people, a lot of Africans, particularly African socialists, argue that you're better off with China than you are with American imperialism. And that can seem that way because China, as I said, offers better deals. It often offers them to filthy dictators, and it's interested in access to resources rather than doing things for ordinary people. But it is worth saying what America was doing in the 1950s, when America went and spoke to people in Africa and said, do deals with us, and we will help you get rid of these filthy imperialist British and French, because they wanted access to the resources in the markets. Once they'd got them, they moved in the military, they moved in the IMF and all the things that started cracking down. And I think China, there's no reason to think that China will behave any differently. And there's two reasons for that. One is China has joined the World Trade Organization. It's very much for anyone who thinks that the Chinese government, because it claims to be communist, is more likely to help workers and poor people. They should probably look at what's happening to workers and poor people in China, who are being severely cracked down on by a government that really doesn't want wages to go up. Just want to finish up by saying something about what's happened over the past couple of years, over the experience of what African governments have looked at to the poor in Africa over the COVID crisis, where during lockdown, the very poor, people living in marginal communities are often seen as a problem. So rather than think who we should be giving food to, we should be giving health care to, they're seen as people who should be cracked down on by the military. In Kenya, again, this was seen as a chance to take a shanty town in the capital, Nairobi, and push it away. That stops it being a COVID problem in the government's eyes, because it means you don't have this unhealthy poor people crowded together. What actually happened was the poor people were still there and they rioted. So it was a disastrous policy, but it says something about how many governments are treating people within their countries. And there's no particular reason to think that the intervention of any imperial power, and I hope I've given the impression that pretty much all the imperial powers behave in the same way because they're there for the same reasons, will make any difference. But there is a wave of hope sweeping across Africa and indeed the global south. And that has been the mass uprisings, most notably in Sudan, where people took to the streets again. I mean, this is a year ago now, but there have been an ongoing series of protests. And these are protests where the massive ordinary people and workers are expressing their own power. I mean, I think they need a more ideological understanding of who they can't rely on, whether it's the Chinese or various international leaders. But it shows something where the best changes have come from people rising up and relying on themselves, not relying on any imperial power. And I think that shows a degree of hope in challenging the new imperialism. And remember that the old imperialism was pushed back, never defeated, but pushed back by people rising up and actually taking power into their own hands. So I shall leave it there and hope that people will have questions to ask or things to say perhaps about specific places.